In June of 1965, Sylvia Likens and her younger sister Jenny would be with their mother Betty while she got caught shoplifting. Betty would be arrested and the two girls would wander around the city looking for a place to stay. Fortunately, they would run into their friend Paula, who would bring them to her house. She would then introduce Sylvia and Jenny to her mother, Gertrude Baniszewski. After this, Gertrude would allow the two sisters to stay at her house for the night. However, this would turn into being a long-term stay. The next day, Sylvia's father Lester would knock on the door. He would state that he had just been hired to work at a carnival. He would also inform the girls that their mother would be released from jail that same day and would be joining him in the new job. Due to it being far from home, both Lester and Betty would be given a place to stay for work. However, there was no place for Sylvia or Jenny. And with that, Lester would make an agreement with Gertrude that if his daughters could stay, he would send $20 a week. Gertrude, being short on cash, agreed to this and took both girls in. Had Lester stepped inside and seen the horrible state of disrepair the house was in, he would have surely taken back his offer. Unfortunately, he was too excited about his new job and rushed off, leaving the girls in the hands of Gertrude. In the week following this, Sylvia and Jenny would find themselves in the midst of a teenage paradise. Within the house, there were no rules or structure. Although Gertrude was an adult, she displayed little form of authority over the sisters and the other kids in the home. Even with this, Gertrude would still send Sylvia and Jenny off to school in order to keep up her image of being a perfect mother figure. Around this time, Sylvia and Jenny would return home from school one day only to find the house empty. After searching around, they would find Gertrude and Paula in one of the back rooms. Instantly, Gertrude and Paula would grab the two girls and throw them into the same pile of dirty laundry they used as a bed. As it turned out, their father had failed to send the $20 that week, sending Gertrude into an enraged frenzy. With a wooden stirring stick in hand, she would pull down Sylvia and Jenny's undergarments and use it to beat their thighs and backsides. Once Gertrude was satisfied, she informed the girls that if their father would not pay, they would be beaten. She continued, leaving the flesh of the two girls beet red. The more they screamed, the more excited Gertrude became. Gertrude would then state that she would prostitute Sylvia if their father hadn't sent the money by the end of the week. However, the check would arrive the next morning. As it turned out, the check had been delayed by the postal service. Only a few days later, Sylvia and Jenny would go out to collect empty soda cans. They would do this in order to exchange them for money at the recycling center. Due to there being little to no food in the house, they would have to resort to this in order to get money for food. With the money they had made, they would purchase candy, bring it back to the home, and share it with the rest of the children. For whatever reason, this would send Gertrude into another frenzy as she would accuse them of stealing. Sylvia would be dragged into another room, have her skirt and undergarments pulled off by Gertrude, and receive another beating to her bare backside. Using another wooden spoon, the demented woman would bring it down again and again to Sylvia's flesh. Gertrude would gaslight Sylvia and Jenny into admitting they had stolen the candy. With tears streaming down the girls' faces, they would catch glimpses of the other children laughing and smiling. These smiles would only be the beginning of their humiliation. Days would pass. Over the last few months, Sylvia and Jenny had been losing weight. By this point, neither had eaten in 3 days. Luckily for them, Gertrude would send them and her own children to church. It was there the Reverend would allow them to eat from the church donations. Due to them being starving at this time, they would both eat as much as they could. Unfortunately, Gertrude would catch word of this and again become enraged. Sylvia would be degraded, mocked, and gaslit in front of the other kids, which would bring her to tears. Sylvia's weakness would again excite Gertrude. And with this, Gertrude would drag the frightened girl by her hair to the kitchen, forcing her to sit in one of the wooden chairs. From here, Gertrude would take an old stale hot dog and bun, then smother them with ketchup and mustard. With condiments dripping to the kitchen floor, she would walk toward Sylvia before forcing it into her mouth. As she choked on the hot dog, Gertrude screamed at the top of her lungs, going on about how no man would ever want Sylvia because of how fat and disgusting she was. Before Sylvia had a chance to even finish chewing the food, Gertrude would ram another into her mouth. This would cause her to vomit. Afterwards, her tormentor would demand that she eat one more hot dog. She would somehow manage to do so despite being nauseous from the mustard. It was then that Gertrude would reveal a twisted smile, telling her to eat the vomit on the floor. Before she had a chance to protest, Gertrude would force Sylvia to the ground. She would then move the girl's face into the putrid mess of ketchup, mustard, and stomach acid. While she ate her own vomit, the other children would let out their cackles. After this, Gertrude would grab Sylvia's hair, using the young girl's face as a mop to push around the body fluids. Eventually, it would all be over and Gertrude would lift Sylvia up, again, gaslighting her to believe it was all her fault. A week later, Sylvia's parents would come to visit. Gertrude, not wanting them to see the inside of the house, would arrange for them to meet at a local park. Lester and Betty would be shocked by the weight loss of the two girls. However, Gertrude would come up with a lie that they had both decided to go on a diet. Unfortunately, Lester and Betty would believe this along with many other lies. Gertrude would successfully paint herself as a loving mother figure. And with this, Sylvia felt powerless to tell her parents the truth about the abuse and neglect, about how she had been forced to eat her own vomit like an animal. Lester and Betty would hand Gertrude an envelope full of cash and then leave the same day. Strangely enough, Sylvia and Jenny not telling their parents about the abuse would put Gertrude in a good mood for the next few weeks. Even Paula and Stephanie, who normally egged on the abuse, followed their mother's footsteps and began to act friendly toward the pair. Eventually, the abuse would stop entirely. Rather than stay out of everyone's way as they had been, Sylvia and Jenny would begin hanging out with the other teenagers. During this time, Sylvia would admit that she once kissed a boy. The other kids in the room would applaud and cheer. But Gertrude, this filled her with nothing but pure rage. She would slap Sylvia in the face and then push her out of her chair. This would result in Sylvia hitting her head against the wall, while Gertrude continued her verbal abuse. Sylvia would be referred to as a prostitute and a whore again and again in front of the other kids. Ironically, Gertrude's own daughter Paula was very promiscuous, and she knew this. In fact, Paula was pregnant. Soon, she would instruct one of the boys in the room to hold Sylvia's legs open. Gertrude would then repeatedly kick Sylvia in the crotch before deciding the girl was no longer allowed to sit in any chair in the house. At this point, Gertrude considered Sylvia to be a lesser being, an animal. There would be a few times that Sylvia would absent-mindedly sit in a chair in the house. This would result in more yelling and verbal abuse. In the days following this, Sylvia would retaliate by spreading rumors at school that Paula and Stephanie were prostitutes. She would also reveal the horrible state of the house, something Gertrude desperately tried to keep a secret. Unfortunately, this would come back to haunt Sylvia. The rumors would be traced back to her by Stephanie's friends, who would then inform a boy named Coy Hubbard. Coy, who was Stephanie's boyfriend, would become enraged by this. After school, he would head to Gertrude's house. There, he would tell Gertrude about the rumors Sylvia had spread at school. After hearing about this, she would allow him to stay in the living room until Sylvia returned home. Once she arrived, Coy would threaten and then reduce her to tears. This would have been it if it hadn't been for Gertrude. Gertrude would encourage Coy to physically assault Sylvia, which he did. Sylvia would receive a punch straight to her cheek and then fall to the ground. After this, the room would fall silent. Unfortunately, it wouldn't stop here. Coy would stand her up, grab her arm, and flip her onto her back. He would do so again. Gertrude would then inform him of how to get to the basement. And with that, Coy would drag Sylvia by her ponytail down the basement steps before slamming her against a wall. He would do so many times while Gertrude sat on the stairs watching in enjoyment. Eventually, Coy would stop and head back up the basement stairs. Gertrude would grab his thigh, inviting him to come back and practice his judo on Sylvia in the near future. She would inform him that he was welcome to come do so anytime he liked. Coy would agree to this and leave the house. After this, Gertrude would turn to Sylvia and state that she would be staying in the basement that night. This was ignoring the fact that she could have been possibly suffering from internal injuries. Following that, Gertrude would shut the lights off and close the door behind her. Sylvia would be left bleeding in the dark on that cold, dusty basement floor. Once morning came, she woke up bruised and battered. Her body was swollen and she could barely move a muscle. Even so, she would manage to make it upstairs where she would suffer more of Gertrude's verbal abuse. Starting from that morning, Coy would come often and practice his martial arts techniques on Sylvia down in the basement. Now, despite all the chaos within the household, Sylvia would find some normalcy by bringing her friend Anna home. However, Gertrude would soon convince Anna that Sylvia had been spreading lies about her mother. This would result in Sylvia being repeatedly assaulted and losing her friend. Not only this, but it would soon be believed throughout the town that Sylvia was a liar. She would soon lose the remaining friends she had. Even adults, such as the pastor and school teachers who previously took pity on her, would now turn their backs to her. At this point, Gertrude had successfully warped reality for hundreds of people. A few days later, Stephanie would throw a party at her house, inviting many kids from her school. During this party, one of the girls from school would begin slapping Sylvia. As it turned out, Gertrude had lied again, stating that Sylvia had told more lies that the girl's mother was a whore. Sylvia refused to fight back and the girl would eventually leave the party. However, this would infuriate Gertrude, who would then give Jenny a choice. Either physically assault her older sister or spend a week in the basement with no food. With tears dripping from her eyes, Jenny would repeatedly punch Sylvia in the face, only stopping when her knuckles were bruised. After this, Sylvia would make her way back to her room away from the chaos. In the days following, she would show up to school with more and more bruises. This was largely due to Coy escalating his violence down in the basement. Because of Gertrude's heavy grip on the reality surrounding the situation, no one would question the marks on Sylvia. Soon, the start of a new school year would begin. Sylvia would turn to Gertrude for money to purchase a tracksuit for gym class. Gertrude would refuse, not wanting to spend a penny on her. With Sylvia not following the dress code, this would cause a fear that the school would visit the house and discover the horrible state it was in. She further feared she would be blamed by Gertrude for the discovery. And so the next day, she would enter the locker room and steal a random student's tracksuit. Luckily for her, no one would notice. No one except Gertrude when she brought the clothes home. Sylvia would be questioned and then beaten. After this, Gertrude would throw the girl on the floor and repeatedly kick her in the crotch. As she squirmed in pain, the middle-aged woman would hold her down and press her cigarette to one of her fingers. She would do another, and another, and another. Soon, all 10 of Sylvia's fingers had burn marks on them. This wasn't enough for Gertrude. In the days following, Sylvia would be subjected to humiliation. Her skirt and underwear would be pulled off in front of the other kids in the living room. She would then be beaten with a belt until she collapsed to the ground. The other kids would be encouraged by Gertrude to use Sylvia's bare flesh to put out their cigarettes. Coy would take pleasure in this by putting out his cigarette into her inner thigh. Soon, her body would be riddled with burn marks. Due to her lack of sleep and malnourishment, Sylvia's body had stopped healing itself. The burn marks on her fingers from the previous week were still just as bad as the day she received them. Sylvia saw the signs of her body shutting down and realized she needed to do something. And so that evening, she would walk around the city in search of more soda bottles to recycle. She would eventually get enough money for a bite to eat. This would be the first time her stomach had been filled in weeks. Satisfied, she would go back to the house, sneak in, and go straight to her room. Once she walked through the door, she'd find Gertrude glaring at her. The furious woman would drag her to the living room in front of the other teenage boys, accusing her of prostituting herself. After this, Gertrude would force her to strip down naked in front of the other kids. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough. Sylvia would be handed a glass soda bottle. It was here that she would be forced to open her legs and insert it inside of herself. Once again, the girl would be reduced to tears from the pure humiliation. Due to her never having intercourse, the bottle wouldn't go past her hymen. And with this, Gertrude would become impatient and kick the end of the bottle. This would result in half the bottle going inside Sylvia, who would then collapse to the floor in pain. Gertrude, disregarding the pool of blood forming in front of her, would violently rip the bottle out. This would result in Sylvia shrieking and passing out from the pain. Stephanie and Paula would then drag her bleeding body and leave it in the back room. She would wake in the morning to find that she had wet the bed. Terrified of being caught, she would attempt to wash her clothes before Gertrude found out. Unfortunately, she would fail and suffer even more verbal abuse. Dry blood covering her still naked body, she dropped to the floor and wept. Her tears would not move Gertrude. In fact, Gertrude would repeatedly kick, then drag her to the basement stairs. It was here that Sylvia would be pushed down the staircase, sending her tumbling into the darkness. Despite her pleading for a doctor, Gertrude would leave her there in the cold without any clothes. The next morning, Sylvia would be found to have wet herself again. This was due to the horrible state her body was in. Regardless, Gertrude would round up Coy, her son John, as well as a neighborhood boy named Ricky. Together, they would drag Sylvia upstairs to the bathroom and draw her a bath of scalding hot water. By the time the bath was ready, the water was too hot to touch. Despite this, Sylvia would be dropped into the boiling hot water. The group would hold her down as she screamed and attempted to escape. Her skin would soon become red and raw while the group scrubbed off the top layer of her flesh. Gertrude and the group would spend the next few minutes rubbing salt into her fresh wounds, increasing the pain. After this, she would be brought back to the basement, dropped on the concrete floor, and left there. Unfortunately, the scalding hot bath would soon become a new device of torture that Gertrude would perform on a regular basis. Occasionally, she would receive these baths 2 to 3 times a day. Outside of this, she would be locked down in the basement in the dark. She would also receive less and less food. If she was lucky, she would receive a small bowl of broth, which she was made to scoop out with her bare hands. Furthermore, she would be given a tin can to use as a toilet. Once a day, members of the group would come down and force her to eat and drink whatever she had left inside. Beyond this humiliation and torture, she would be left alone in the dark inside the basement. Around this time, new neighbors named the Vermilions would move in next door. They would invite Gertrude as well as the group of teenagers in the house to a barbecue. It was here the neighbors would notice that Sylvia had 2 black eyes. When questioned about this, Paula would proudly state that she was the one who did it. Following this, Paula would run home, return with a cup of boiling water, and then splash it in Sylvia's face. Despite this, the new neighbors would not contact the police. In fact, while later asking Gertrude for a garden tool, they would witness Paula beating Sylvia in the face with a belt, splitting her lip in half. Again, they would say nothing. In a last-ditch effort to save themselves, Jenny would send a letter to their older sister Diana. In the letter, all the torture and abuse would be highly detailed. Jenny would beg Diana to send the police to the house. However, Diana would believe none of it. All the torture and abuse would be written off as mere corporal punishment. That letter would be thrown into the garbage. However, she would call social services who would pay the house a visit. And with that, Gertrude would successfully convince them that Sylvia had run away to become a prostitute. The social worker would close the case that same day. Soon after this, the kids in the house would begin charging a nickel for the neighborhood boys to view Sylvia in the basement fully undressed. This would then turn into parading her around the house naked for their amusement. While sexual acts on her were prohibited, Gertrude would encourage the group to continue physically assaulting her. By this time, the acts of violence would draw little to no response from her. Sylvia had completely shut down. Even burning her with a cigarette at this point would only bring out a dull moan. With this, the neighborhood kids would be charged 25 cents to throw Sylvia down the basement stairs. On one night, Gertrude would come down to visit Sylvia, who would then be brought back upstairs and placed in a bed. She She would make a deal with Sylvia that if she could go throughout the night without wetting the bed, she would no longer have to stay in the basement. Sylvia would agree to this, but would not be able to hold up her end of the deal. The glass bottle shoved inside her rendered her incontinent. And with this, she would be forced to strip for the boys in the living room. Due to her malnourished body, it was no longer exciting for them. Gertrude would hand her another glass bottle, demanding she do what she did before. This time, Sylvia would do so with ease. For whatever reason, this would make Gertrude even angrier. And so, she would order one of the boys to gag Sylvia with her own dress. From here, a sewing needle would be placed under a lit match until it was red hot. Next, the group would pin her down to the floor as Gertrude drove it into the flesh on her stomach. Sylvia would thrash and scream as a letter was carved into her skin. Eventually, the words "I'm a prostitute and proud of it" would be engraved into her stomach. Gertrude would leave to get more cigarettes. While she did so, the kids would take turns burning various letters and numbers into Sylvia's flesh. Gertrude would return, taunting Sylvia about how she'd never be able to get married or be able to undress in front of anyone. Following this, Coy would drag her back down to the basement, tossing her into the walls. Moments later, Gertrude would carry her up to one of the beds, letting her sleep there for the night. In the morning, Sylvia would be given a bath. This time, it would be regular temperature and with soap instead of salt. During this bath, she would thank each one of her tormentors. Unfortunately, they still had ill intentions. They would then dress her, bring her downstairs to the kitchen, and give her a pen and paper. It was here that Sylvia would be forced to fabricate a letter to her parents, stating that a gang of boys kidnapped and beat her. Gertrude's plan was to leave her at the local dump for her to die and then hand the letter to police. Sylvia would catch wind of this plan and attempt to flee, but would be caught. She would then be given food for the first time in weeks, but would be unable to swallow any of it. At this point, her throat was swollen from being choked repeatedly. Gertrude would grab a metal curtain rod and ram it into her mouth. She would then continuously bash it into Sylvia's teeth and face. Coy would then take the rod from Gertrude and hit Sylvia over the head with it one last time, leaving the girl unconscious. They would then bring her back down to the basement and leave her there for the night. The next morning, Coy and Gertrude would visit her, only to find her in the same spot. Coy would take the metal rod and begin mercilessly beating her body. Once satisfied, they would again leave. That same night, Sylvia would make a last attempt to save her own life by screaming and beating on the walls of the basement for hours. Unfortunately, no one would come to her rescue. In the morning, she would be brought up for another bath. Once they dropped her in the water, her head would sink below the surface. No bubbles of air would come. CPR would be attempted on her, but by then, she was already dead. Later that night, Gertrude would call the police to report Sylvia missing. Once police arrived, they would be shown the note and have a look around. By this time, they suspected nothing. That is, until Jenny promised to tell them everything if they removed her from the house. Once they did, she would tell them to look in the basement, stating the group had killed Sylvia. With the exception of Jenny, everyone in the house would soon be arrested. An autopsy would be performed on Sylvia, where over 100 cigarette burns would be found on her body. Along with this, she had severe bruises as well as muscle and nerve damage. Her cause of death was ultimately determined to be multiple brain hemorrhages. On April 18, 1966, Gertrude and all members of the group would be put on trial. Gertrude would be convicted of first-degree murder. Her daughter Paula would be convicted of second-degree murder, while Ricky, Coy, and Gertrude's son John would be convicted of manslaughter. Despite being served life in prison, Gertrude would be released in 1985. She would never accept responsibility for the death of Sylvia all the way until her death from lung cancer on June 16, 1990. Her daughter Paula would be released in 1972, assume a new identity, and work as a school counselor for 14 years. However, once the school discovered her true identity, she would be fired. Thank you for watching my video. If you made it this far, consider liking the video since it does help me out in the algorithm. Also, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, subscribe and hit the bell button for video updates. One more thing, if you have a topic or case you want to see me cover, leave a comment down below and I will consider it.